Information uncensored.
Episode of Tales from the Forlorn Dopes. I am your host, Cybersmily.
Your co-host, Wisdom000. Greetings, program.
I was waiting for your tag, man. So this week we have a very special guest. I am kind of a bit of a fanboy because of all the lore he wrote, and it's going to be Will Moss. We appreciate you coming on and joining us, Will.
Gentlemen, it's good to be here with both of you. I'm looking forward to the chat, and it seems like we got a lot to talk about.
Yes, it does seem like there's a lot to talk about,
Absolutely.
Especially with all of your
comments. We named our show after the Adventure Source book you wrote, so if that tells you how big of a fan we are.
Well, congratulations. I now have a grand total of 2 fans, so that's a start. And from this, I will build my empire. So, it's great. But I'm a lot of that stuff is really far in my past. And we were talking about this a little bit before you open the mics here. And it's been kind of fun for me to have an excuse to revisit it and take a trip back in time.
Yeah, great.
So let's ride those waves of nostalgia and get on.
Yeah. So we start
off
with
nostalgia. I've reached a stage of my life where nostalgia is a very big part of like my everyday life. So we'll sink right into that.
Yeah, I think after your 4th decade in the world, you start getting a little more and more of that.
Start seriously looking up plans for a time machine.
Yeah.
That's
So with all our guests, we start off with a quick interview questions. So it's basically what I call the full auto questionnaire, which are basically short questions with short, quick answers. There's no wrong answers, but there is one right answer in this list. So I'm going to start off. 2020,
Talk it to me.
2020, 2045, or 2077?
2020, for sure.
Okay. Favorite cyberpunk role?
Tough one. I think one of my favorite character creations was a media head, and because of my career and where my career ended up going, that was the sort of medias was something I always had an affinity for. That said, I play a lot of solos.
Of course. Favorite piece of cyberware?
Ooh, gotta be the eyes.
Cyber optics? Excellent.
Yeah.
Favorite cyberpunk weapon?
Gotta pass on that one.
All right, no worries.
There's a lot of them.
I know. Favorite cyberpunk read or 2020 book?
Well, the favorite book. I mean, I wrote a bunch of them, and it's going to be a 2020 book because Red is after my time, and this is like asking me to pick among my children.
Obviously, you don't have a lot of children because.
Well, I think so it's even pre-2020, and I'm going to go back to the original Cyberpunk, right? But I think the thing that where I made the biggest contribution, and therefore I've carried forward a huge amount of affection for, are the corporate source books, 1, 2, 3, which I only have 2 today, which really bugs me. But to me, they were such a big part of the world building, and so much of that stuff lived on for a long time. in a way that some of the adventure supplements didn't. That they're the ones that I sort of hold closest to my heart, I would say.
Okay, sure. So next question is least favorite Cyberpunk 2020 book.
Gonna pass on that one too. Can't assassinate my friends.
All right, this question, not sure if you'll get the reference, but Pan Am, Judy, or Rogue?
I do not get the reference, and now I'm dying to know.
It's part of the Cyberpunk 2077 game. This
Except
one,
for
Oh yeah, see, I
Rogue,
haven't
who
played
well,
it yet.
except
was
for Rogue,
great.
yeah.
I've only had a computer that's been up to it for like a month, so you have to give me some time.
I'll give you some time. All right, so we'll
Yeah,
book
no,
you for a
we'll get you
future.
back
Come
on and
back and
get your
revisit that.
reaction.
I know. It's on the list. It's like edgerunners, which we'll talk about, which
Yep.
kind of took me a while to get to, and finally I did.
Well, speaking of Edge Runner, Lucy, Rebecca, or Kiwi?
Oh, Kiwi.
All right, we'll skip the next question because again,
Interesting.
it has
Interesting
references,
character.
to 2077. Next question is David, Maine, or Pilar?
Got to pass.
All right. Favorite Night City gang?
Oh. Oh. That's another tough one. I mean, the one that I remember, and again, this is going to fall back on, I'm going to fall back a lot on things that like I had a role in creating because that's what I remember. And it's been a long time since I played. But like the one I always think back on and wish I had done more with is that I created a psychotic gang based on the Coneheads, and I, honest to God, wish I had done more with them.
Okay. So the Coneheads. Now this one
They
is
were a
probably
poser gang,
yeah.
obviously. But
So this one is going to be, I think, similar to the favorite book is favorite mega corporation.
I think we can guess.
I mean, like there's only one answer to that question, and I have a special claim to it, right? So the favorite mega corporation, like I created a bunch of the mega corporations. That was my job for Mike for a while, was dreaming up corporations. So I wrote all the corporate source books. Amazingly, I then had a career in corporations. So make of that what you will. But I wouldn't have guessed it at the time. But I mean, it's always going to be Arasaka. But because I created it and I put more thought into it than I did into any of the other corporations for a whole bunch of reasons.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
showed.
Yeah, reading your Twitter thread, it definitely sounds like you thought a lot about Arasaka.
There was just a ton of love put into the corporation that everybody loves to hate. It's
we can talk a little more on that, and let's get through
Sure.
these questions. So, favorite Cyberpunk movie?
Huh. It's funny. I made a list yesterday as I was thinking about this, and it's very, very hard to pick. I will, and it kind of depends how you define cyberpunk. And I know you wanted one-word answers, and I'm failing, so you can give me an F for that. I think when I think about things that made like a huge impression on me, obviously Blade Runner did. It came out, as a teenager, and I tried to show it to my kid recently, which was a giant failure. I think maybe one of the movies that made like the hugest impression on me, just in terms of how it rendered a dystopian landscape, was in fact Clockwork Orange,
yeah.
the Stanley Kubrick film, and it's one that's stuck in my imagination in a big way. I mean, it's a really troubling movie and difficult to watch, but as something that embodies a lot of what I think about the cyberpunk genre, I think it's one that's loomed large. But there's a lot of movies that I kind of consider adjacent to cyberpunk that were really important to me. I mean, the Matrix movies were a big deal. I think like all the Hong Kong movies of John Woo, the sort of ornate gunplay, I think that's all very cyberpunk adjacent. And there's a lot of other movies I love, RoboCop, Crow. Even Parasite,
all
the
those
Korean
things.
movie, the Bong Joon-ho movie that came out a couple of years ago, I kind of think of as a sort of cyberpunk movie. Like, I think it's just, there's so many ways when you start talking about what makes cyberpunk that you can start connecting stuff. I'm kind of getting over my skis a little bit here. I watched the original Rollerball, the James Caan movie, a
Yes.
Oh,
couple
I
of
love
weeks
that
ago
movie.
for the first time in maybe 20 years. And I was like, this is a total cyberpunk movie. I didn't, I mean, I knew it
Absolutely.
was like a dark future movie, but I didn't remember how much it was sort of the corporate aspect was important. And it's like a great cyberpunk movie. So I think,
Yeah.
there's a lot there. But A Clockwork Orange is one that was really important to me in terms of just like the dent it made on my head. But
Okay.
boy, is it a difficult movie to watch.
Favorite cyberpunk
Yeah. My
fictional.
mom,
Oh, sorry.
I was gonna say, my dad took my mom to see Clockwork Orange in the hopes that it would, instigate her labor. He was trying to shock her into having me.
Did it work?
Uh no, no. It was a plate of really spicy chili that finally did it.
Yeah,
So moving along.
Billy solves all woes.
Yeah. Favorite cyberpunk fictional character.
Oh my gosh. Um,
Didn't know there was going to be a quiz, did you?
no, I didn't. I would have done my setting. I'm thinking about my list, and I'm thinking about, and I don't want to double dip on a Clockwork Orange. Um, can I offer a character that I think is basically a cyberpunk character, although I don't know that everybody will view it this way, but that also was like
Absolutely.
hugely formative on my young self. Judge Dredd.
Fuck
He's
yeah, it's
definitely
totally
cyberpunk.
cyberpunk.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad we agree on that because I grew up reading Judge Dredd comics. My father was English, and I used to go to England and buy 2000 AD. In fact, I have framed Judge Dredd originals on my wall. I'm looking at them right now. But I think
Ooh, jealousy.
again when I think of Mega City One and the world that the 2000 AD writers and artists built in the sort of late 70s, and the role that Judge Dredd plays. I think he's a cyberpunk character, and I again like he might also if I was elevating one, he might be the one I would elevate.
Okay, good.
That makes perfect sense to me. I mean,
Gibson, Dix,
sure.
or Stevenson?
um, it's a tough one. I liked a lot of the early Gibson, and I think he was such a huge influence on our early thinking about cyberpunk. Um, uh, and I haven't read a lot of his later works. I read stuff sort of back in the day in the 80s. I certainly think he influenced. I read Dick too, and I think he was important. I don't think he. It was like the movies that arose from Dick's work in the 80s that were more influential, I think, upon us than his original novels. Whereas I think Gibson's novels were, uh, uh, were like, they were just like wound incredibly tightly up into what we and what Mike were thinking about, in the 80s when Cyberpunk was being built.
So your answer is Gibson?
Yeah, let's go with Gibson.
Okay.
That makes,
Uh,
yeah.
Favorite cyberpunk novel?
Ooh.
Don't worry, there's one more question after this, and then we're done.
These guys were all hard. You should have front loaded me with these. I would have sounded much smarter. Um,
Yeah, but then you would have thought of the answer, and it's supposed to be quick.
yeah. And I'm trying to think if I have one that I liked above the others or that I went back to. And the answer is I'm not sure that there was. And I'm looking at my bookshelf right now, and there are no cyberpunk novels on it.
Hmm.
Make of that what you will. Um, uh, but but I'm not sure there is one that I would pick,
Okay,
and that's just the way it is.
understandable. The final question is Shadowrun Cyberpunk.
Cyberpunk. I never played Shadowrun, and to me, it was like I don't know. I always. I mean, first of all, I had tribal loyalties, right? Uh, and then I don't think at the time, like when we were all working for RTG, I just don't remember us going across the aisle much, uh, and so, it's always got to be Cyberpunk for me. Now, there were other games that I played a lot back in the day. My gang, we played a lot of Champions, played a certain amount of Call of Cthulhu. We were a big Champions group. We played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons because, of course, we did, right? Like that was like the long running game we had. But the only Cyberpunk game I played was Cyberpunk, and I played the other RPG games too, especially Teenagers from Outer Space, which we used to really enjoy running at the conventions, which is, of course, not really a
It's a super
Cyberpunk
fun
game.
game.
It is a lot of fun, especially if you have the right head for it. It took me a while to kind of get on the right anarchic wavelength. Uh, um, but I think that in the right hands, a huge amount of fun.
Yeah, I mean, you got to be on the same page. You got to come from the mindset of like Project Eiko or Yurei Yatsura.
Yeah, and then and I think that's exactly right. I think those shows were big influences, but I think you also have to kind of come from Warner Brothers, right? Like
Sure.
you sort of you like just a certain amount of like pure cartoon. It doesn't make any sense lunacy, like anvil on the head lunacy. I think is the kind of secret to that game, and if you embrace that, then it's a lot of fun.
So is that yes, it is Cyberpunk?
Oh yeah, it's cyberpunk. I mean, the answer is cyberpunk. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
long-winded way of saying it is now and forever. It's cyberpunk.
In my opinion, that's the only question you can get wrong, and you got it wrong.
No, he didn't. He got it right.
He
He's
explained
choosing
his answer.
Cyberpunk. He's not choosing. He's not saying Shadowrun is Cyberpunk. He's saying in his head, Cyberpunk is his Cyberpunk.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
what I'm getting out of what he's saying.
Yeah, and like you have to understand like my relationship with the material here, right? Like there were games that I played, but because I was writing for RTG Cyberpunk, when I was in my sort of early 20s, and I, like I spent, like I lived the life of a writer, right? Like I spent just days locked in my head with that universe, like me and the computer, I would get a contract from Mike to go write something, and it was always wonderful when that happened because I would get an advance, which meant I could buy food, which was otherwise an iffy proposition. And I would, my writing hours were like 2 p.m. till the wee hours. And I spent just days in my one bedroom apartment, like just locked up with the computer till God knows what time of night, just like in that world, which was like a level of intimacy I never had with anything else. And like the only thing that probably consumed as many hours of my life was my high school D&D game, which was like a long running mega classic where we used to do a weekly all nighter, which was probably better than going out and doing crimes as far as my mom was
Or
concerned,
drugs.
but maybe only incrementally. But I don't think you can. I mean, for me, I can't disentangle how I feel about cyberpunk from having been kind of like locked up in a room with the material for like so many hours, days, months, and years, uh, and so it just lives in a different place in my head than any of the other games do.
Okay. So before we continue, I just want to tell our audience exactly who you are, right, when it comes to Cyberpunk. So You've been credited with writing or contributing to the Cyberpunk 2020 base book. Did you write any of the Cyberpunk 2013, or was that purely Mike?
Yeah, we know we all, like a bunch of us contributed to it,
Okay.
and we're working with Mike into the run up. So I'm sure. I mean, more of my time was spent on the supplemental material for that original Cyberpunk, and
Yep.
then for 2020. But yeah, we were all sort of banging our heads together.
Okay.
I mean, Mike was the main creative force
Yeah.
for it, though.
So you wrote Corporate Book 1, 2, and 3. You wrote Tales from the Forlorn Hope, which, of course, we're named after. Live and Direct, Night City Sourcebook, Solos 1 and 2, Rocker Boy, Land of the
Parts of them.
Free.
Those were group efforts contributed to.
They
Let's be
are.
clear.
You were credited as a writer of in these books. I'm not saying you get all the credit for some of these books,
Thank
except
you.
for the corporate books 1, 2, 3, which you are the main author.
And Tales from the
A
Forlorn
Tale
Hope
from
and
the Hopes. Yep. So
uh,
Rocker Boy, Land of the
Land of Free.
Free, When Gravity Fails. You also wrote some of the Dream Park books. Now I'm confused because I've seen credit that you worked on Cyberpunk version 3. Is that
I don't
accurate or
remember
no?
doing that. And I mean, so this is a long time ago. And I don't remember working on it, but it's also possible that I did stuff that got carried forward, right?
Yep,
Like
that's
that
true.
might be how that happened. Um, what year did 2020 come out? Uh,
2000.
1990,
Did it? Two, not tw- oh 2020. Sorry.
2020.
I thought you meant
yeah,
version 3.
V3, I think,
2020.
came out in what, 2004,
Somewhere around
2005?
there.
But
Yeah,
yeah, there
I
was a
wasn't
lot of
writing.
material that did get carried over.
Yeah, so I didn't write for Mike after I moved to Asia in 1995. Now, I was working on the Cyberpunk game project for the first 14 months I was in Asia. We'll talk about that. But I didn't write for him anymore after that. And then I was like, I was, I got sort of assimilated into the world of like working in tech startups and like just full-time gigs. So anything of mine that's like where my name appears after 1995, it's just old work getting pulled forward or that because I was I wasn't sort of doing projects anymore.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, there's all your credits. You also did a little bit of authoring in some other books that were not cyberpunk related. Um, at least I think you were. I'm not 100% sure.
Well, it was definitely the Dream Park stuff where I did that triplet of supplements, and I can't remember. I don't. I don't know if I contributed any written material to teenagers or uh, um,
Mecton.
uh, Mecton. I did not. We played Mecton, and that was what Mike was had done when I met him. Mecton was kind of his the project that was underway, and of course we were all sort of Japanese giant robot fans. I don't remember contributing to Mecton. I mean, like I will tell you that 90% of what I did was Cyberpunk, and then the kind of other stuff was on the side, as it were.
Okay.
So how did you get involved with Artel Sorian? Obviously you became one of their major writers, especially in those early days. But how did you meet up with them?
Well, so I was a nerd, and it kind of goes without saying, I suppose. And uh, um, I had in high school, in the early '80s, because I'm old. I had I had discovered and fallen in love with anime principally through Star Blazers, right? The Americanized version of Yamato,
Yeah.
which I discovered in the afternoons, and like immediately I was like, "What is this?" And I'd always been a science fiction fan, and then that was just like so unlike anything I'd ever seen. So I started like devouring anime when I was in high school. I got to college in 1981. This is, I was like a big anime head, and I got to the dorms, and I immediately put up all of my like anime posters in my half of my dorm room, which was like a big advertisement for like you will never get laid. And 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 my roommate shows up later, and my roommate, my freshman year of college, was a very nice guy, but he was older because he had spent 4 years in the Navy before going to university, the University of California at Santa Cruz. And he shows up and finds, and I'm not there, and half the room is covered in Japanese posters. And he's like, I don't get it. Is my roommate Japanese, or what's going on here? At any rate, he thought I was a complete weirdo, and couldn't believe his like bad luck at winding up with me. We got along fine, mostly because he immediately got a girlfriend and vanished from our room for the rest of the year. But yeah, I don't know. My socialization as a nerd was that first year was an adventure. But so 1981, 82, my freshman year at Santa Cruz, my buddies and I, and a couple of my high school friends had also gone to Santa Cruz. We were, so we were sort of together. We discovered this comic and game store called Game-A-Lot, which was in the basement of this sort of Victorian retail building, the Cooper House on Pacific Garden Mall in Santa Cruz. It would later be trashed in the earthquake of 1989.
I remember that.
And, it was the local comic book and game store. I remember walking into it, like, for the first time and seeing this, like, giant cherub-cheeked, red-headed guy sitting at a green felt gaming table with a bunch of supplements open, like, just eating, like chewing on an unsliced gallo salami, and thinking to myself, these are my people. I found them. That was Mike McDonald, with whom I would, do a lot of cyberpunk related work, and later who would join my adventures in Asia and become a good friend I'm still in touch with today. But so Mike was working there part-time, and I don't remember who introduced me to him, but like, I met him, and we, and he was a big anime head, and he was talking about doing a game based on Japanese giant robots, and I thought that was, that all sounded really cool, and we kind of, I guess we started hanging out together mostly to like watch movies, like watch anime, and like, he was living in Aptos near Santa Cruz at the time, and so that was the kind of genesis of it. I think of it as arising out of the culture that had blossomed in that store, Game-A-Lot, which was literally in a basement, like a lightless basement, underneath this building in Santa Cruz, and but it was great. Like, it was a great little bunch of people, and he sort of assembled this kind of weird tribe of fellow traveler nerds who were like playing the games with him, playing, his first versions of Mechton and watching anime, and later I think would become the sort of the group that was at the creative core of Cyberpunk, which is the next project along the line.
So you played Traveler with Mike in the original days?
I haven't thought about Traveler in 1,000 years. I don't remember if we did or did not. I definitely remember watching a lot of anime at his place.
Okay.
I remember watching, but I don't remember playing Traveler. Maybe we did. This is like 35 years ago, and like a lot of Manhattans. So like, the memories are spotty. I haven't thought about this stuff for a long time.
It's funny that you talk about comics and anime and that being your in, because that was my in as well, into the game. Is, I had gotten introduced to anime around 1987, after dabbling with what came on sporadically on American television. And it was my love of things like Bubblegum Crisis and Appleseed and things like that.
I can't believe I didn't mention any anime movies when we were talking about like cyberpunk movies or anime characters. But beside the point. Continue.
It was my love of Appleseed and Bubblegum Crisis that when I finally was introduced to Cyberpunk by my anime friends at the Kansas City Art Institute, that I was like, holy shit, this is the game that speaks to me. Written by people who, if I knew them, we'd get along famously. Like that was in my
Right.
head. That was my head canon.
So you reminded me of another sort of like foundational movie that I didn't mention, which was Akira. You know,
Oh yeah,
like which was which was also a big part of the aesthetic and like how we were thinking about it. Akira, Megazone 23, you know, uh, um, uh, these things were like they were definitely like a big part of what was floating around in our heads as we kind of went through this. Akira
Yeah,
might have been a little bit later. It might have been after we started. I'm trying to think about when it came out, but I know that it made a big dent when it did come out.
89, 87,
Yeah, so we
89,
were
something
already,
like that.
yeah, I want to think we were already kind of doing cyberpunk stuff, but it like, I don't know, like that movie was like, it definitely rang everybody's bell.
Yeah, I remember the first time I saw it anywhere was at a one of the Kansas City comic book conventions. I had been reading My the Psychic Girl, and I just looked down at the Marvel booth because Epic Comics, the Marvel imprint, was running the Akira comic, and they were advertising. But I thought it was like an animated My, uh, and yeah, just things dominoed into place from that point forward.
yeah, and I
That
think
stuff was really powerful. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
so. So from my experience, right? Yes, I remember Star Blazer when growing up, and Robotech, and that kind of was like a little bit of the anime that I got into. But once I started playing Cyberpunk, that's when I actually got a lot more exposed to anime and manga, and really I was kind of brought in to that genre from that avenue because I've been gaming for since 78, 78. So for me, gaming has always been like my main focus. A little bit of the Marvel comics and DC comics, but yeah, when Cyberpunk came out, it was just an eye opener compared to like any of the other role playing games I've played. So
I mean, I think Cyberpunk as a game is, it's it was always interesting in a way that some of the other games weren't because it was, they say that like the saying is that science fiction is always really about the present, right? It's always a way of kind of articulating your feelings about the present in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely true of Cyberpunk, and it was definitely true of our version of the Cyberpunk, our version of Cyberpunk, I should say. Like, and you know, it was not only was it hugely influenced by like anime and like Japanese pop culture of the 80s, as was as Mekton was as well, but Cyberpunk was also much more directly rooted in like uh, um, our, sort of like a whole basket of like Reagan era neurosis, right? Like neurosis about Japan's rise and America's problems and our entanglements in Central America and you have to remember this is like what was happening as we were writing Cyberpunk was like the emergence of consumer computing, which was when I was in high school.
yeah,
Like when I started high school, nobody had computers, and when I finished high school, most of the households of my friends had a computer. And by the time I finished college in 1989, like we all had individual computers. That happened during those decades. And so like computing power moving into the proximity of like regular people was kind of another part of that. Like, where is this going to go and what's it going to mean? And I remember, I have a very clear memory. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's a hallucination, but it stuck with me for a long time of like a bunch of us sitting around in Mike's living room in Aptos. And this was like Mike's superpower was to like just dream up crazy stuff that the rest of us couldn't see. And Mike holding up like a paperback book, it probably was a Bruce Sterling novel, and um, and saying, "Can you guys imagine like when our personal computers are like the size of this book?" And all of us being like, "Mike, that'll never happen," like bullshit, like impossible. But like so credit to Mike for seeing the mobile revolution way before the rest of us did. But you know, that idea of like technology beginning to kind of invade our lives, that was very much also a product of the 80s when like computers were becoming a personal item in a way that they hadn't been before. And so I think all of that kind of got folded into Cyberpunk, and Cyberpunk is about the present. And that's also why, you can go back and revisit the early writing and you can see kind of it's such a fascinating mix to me of things we really got right, the Eurodollar, and and kind of the political fracturing of the world and then ever more intimate relationships with technology, and our relationships with technology now are like super intimate, but also the stuff we just got hilariously wrong because it was like tinged to the 80s. Like I wrote a Soviet state oil company into being, which was like, that ceased to be relevant, about sort of 5 years after I created it.
I mean, you
And also
guys
this, like,
predicted the end of the Soviet Union as it was, like the
that was
reunification of
later.
the West and everything.
Not at the beginning. We didn't. At the beginning, like in the first version, it's still around. But we were adaptable and always willing to revise. And definitely, and this is a big part of the whole like 80s mental state, and you all remember, is just like not just the Japanese pop culture, but this sense that like Japan was ascendant and it was going to like, like kind of leave a dent on the rest of the world, which, I like, I don't think it's funny to me as somebody who was infatuated, was a Japanophile and studied Japanese, and like got sucked into this and then thought that I would wind up in Asia, like probably in or around Japan. And I did wind up in Asia, but not in Japan. Um, you know, Looking at the landscape today and seeing Japan really like in terms of like economic impact second to China and strategic impact second to China, and in pop culture impact like secondary to Korea. Like it's really interesting to me, like
Yeah.
how different the landscape of 2020 is from like you know like what we got right and what we got wrong, and I dwell on that a lot because it tells me a lot about how we thought about that stuff back in the day and what it was rooted in.
Yeah, and I think from a perspective of like viewing, especially in Cyberpunk with Japan, there's an idea of what Japan is, right, and the culture itself. So if you look at like even like China at the time and Korea at the time, they were very. I'm not gonna. I don't want to be derogative in that they were a little bit backwards in their mentality and
They were still
understanding.
very much developing countries. Like
Yeah,
it's not
yeah,
wrong to say that. Yeah.
right. So they didn't quite understand the what the modern world was, whereas Japan, I think in the '80s, kind of embraced that, and it's through history. You look at cultures, any culture, you'll see that any culture is going to repeat past mistakes of that culture, or they just for whatever reason something works for them, so they try to continue it. And I think Japan is one of those cultures that and you look at their history, you had the Tokugawa period or the Edo period for centuries, and they're very rigid in what they think. So they'll have a burst of ideas and technology, or ideas and forward thinking and innovation, and it just culminates, and then all of a sudden the culture just like says, okay, we're at that plateau, let's continue that plateau, because they ride that wave as long as they can. And I think that's kind of what happened with Japan from the 80s. They tried to ride that wave, and economically it did not work for them, right? Because of the crash that happened in the 90s. And they still try. I mean, they're still the third economic power of the world.
Oh yeah, they're a giant. Yes, if you don't take the EU as a group,
Yeah.
then, and it's probably best to not, then yeah, I think they're number three, and definitely like a giant economy and a sort of big force on the world economically, and still in some ways culturally.
Yep.
Um, eh, but in the 80s, like in our imaginations, Japan was going to create the future, right? When we
Yeah.
imagined technology, and like, I think back on how powerful the Japanese consumer brands were, like, you know, like Sony,
Mm.
was like, just was an
Monolithic. I
unbelievable
mean,
consumer electronics behemoth, and it did create things. Like, I remember when the Walkman came out, and like people were like, "Oh my God, the teenagers are all screwed," because they're going to be disconnected forever. Like, it caused a moral panic, which is
Right.
hilarious in retrospect. But
Oh,
yeah.
every new technology does. Um,
or even the floppy disk,
and
which Japan, invented, which
yeah,
brought
yeah. Well,
computing to
and
like
and
another level.
And I think also probably the compact disc, I think,
Yeah.
was a Matsushita creation. Like a lot of, I mean, they really did like create a bunch of those technologies back in the day. And, we drew the dotted line from that. Like, these guys are going to create the new technologies forever. And that cycle turned in a big way, which is really interesting. And in fact, the opposite happened, where sort of Japan became an island unto itself in many ways in terms of technology, sort of literally and metaphorically, which was not what we expected. But at the time, it was very easy to extrapolate and to extrapolate the strength of their companies. And that was very much like, I mean, like, that's what the creation of Arasaka owes itself to, right? You could imagine in the early 80s, it was easy to imagine that, like, the globe's spanning behemoth corporations of, what was then 30 years in the future, we're going to be these, we're going to be Zaibatsu, Japanese, conglomerates. Like, that was very, very easy to imagine. Um, and
Yeah. I
that
mean, it
was
was being pushed
very much,
everywhere at the time. Like, this
yeah,
is going to be the
absolutely.
future. Like, not
Yeah.
only with
And,
science fiction, just with like contemporary culture. Like that was undoubtedly going to be the future. And then,
right. And so we
it
all kind
didn't.
of surfed that wave. And it didn't materialize that way, which I think is interesting, and that does make me. And I wrote about this a bit in that Twitter thread that I shared with both of you, which I was responding to somebody else's insight. It wasn't an original thought, and I want to give credit to where it's due, which in this case is to a Chinese uh, maker and tweeter named Naomi Wu. But she was the one who talked about cyberpunk as in its classic form as being a sort of a future extrapolated from the 80s, even as it's made today. Even like edgerunners, like that is it remains a kind of. I know we keep moving the date back, right? Cyberpunk 2077, is in the case of the game, the computer game, the CD Projekt Red game. But uh, uh, I think what she got right is that fundamentally there's an element to cyberpunk which is really a parallel world imagined from the 1980s, right? Like, it's less an extrapolation of where we are today than I think a sort of a what if, the world
Yeah.
as we had imagined it then had come into being, and which is fine, but I think you sort of have to recognize that as like an inherent part of the genre. In that case, its relationship is closer to steampunk, right, which is a sort of alternate. Like, cyberpunk is an alternate reality, no,
Yeah. I
no,
mean,
no
that's
matter
the way
how far back you move the date.
I've
Yeah.
always described it to people. Is it's an alternate future or at this point, alternate past, but with the divergent point being 1990.
Yeah.
Like, this is what happens
And I think
when
that
these technologies take off.
that difference between the punks that came out of cyberpunk, right? So you have steampunk, you have diesel punk, you have all these other punks that kind of borrowed from cyberpunk, and even the authors of those genres and the persons who created that punk terminology will always say, yeah, we go to cyberpunk and we just add punk to the end of whatever future we have. A lot of those, I think, was, and that's that's the weird genre between those system or those genres, as it were, versus cyberpunk, which is cyberpunk was at the time, and of course it's 30 years later that we're looking at this, that cyberpunk was really about, hey, we're broadcasting in the near future as opposed to looking back or backwards thinking, which of course now that a there wasn't a war in South America versus America. There wasn't a South Am War two. There wasn't a bioplague. O'Neill stations weren't created, etc. So it was kind of a immediate forward thinking that Cyberpunk tried to have. Like, hey, this is going to start happening next year, versus some of the genres of like steampunk, which was, oh yeah, what happened if? And I think that's the imagination that and the whole. I'm trying to think of the genre, historical fantasy, right, or alternative historical genre of what ifs, right? And I think
Right.
cyberpunk at the time was like, what if this happens? Now that we retrospectively look at it, it's like, oh yeah, okay, so what if that happened? This is how it would have gone. Versus, I'm sure at the time you guys were thinking, well, we're at a divergence of what possibly might happen and what reality is going to, actually do.
Oh yeah, I mean, from 1980, you could. I mean, some of it was obviously science fiction, like, but some of it you could, you were sort of like, well, these are things we can imagine, like this could happen. Um, and so I think it was a mix of like plausible guessing about what the future of the world might be, but also like straight up science fiction, which was what made it fun. But that brings up something that I wanted to talk about with both of you, which is kind of the idea of like the canon, right? And just because I was looking at some of the chatter in the Discord server before, which I thought was interesting, and I do think there are different ways you can relate to this material, and it can be fun to it can be fun to play canon RPG Cyberpunk and to think about like what's part of that universe if you like it, and it's a great like it's a fun universe and a fun canvas for the imagination, whether that's in fantasy gaming or TV or video games. Like there's a lot you can do with it, and there's a lot of good ingredients in the canon. I think so. One of the things I think about in terms of it being sort of rooted in this '80s vision is, and this was part of my reaction to Edge Runner, was like sometimes this sense that it can be a little bit frozen in amber, like this idea of the sort of like, you know, anime rooted aesthetic, Japanophilic, sort of body modification, the tropes, right? It can
Yep.
be like, you can fall into the tropes of like classic cyberpunk. But I think, like we're at a very interesting place and time in history in our relationship with technology. And I've been thinking about this recently, just watching the sort of, I'm going to describe it as a moral panic because I think it is in some ways, but the sort of moral panic about the rise of like AI and large language models, right? And like how people are reacting to this or how they reacted to social media before it. Like, I think there are, like there are really interesting ways to think about what the essential ingredients of quote cyberpunk unquote are and how you can kind of remix them into new and different ways. And I was thinking a little bit before this conversation about like what some of the the what I thought the default ingredients of cyberpunk were, and I'd love to get your opinions about this. But I think to me, the sort of key ingredients are like the sort of the anti-corporate sensibility, or the idea that like the sort of corporations are the true root of power, and sort of fundamentally sinister is one pillar. The idea that there's social breakdown is another pillar, and the idea of the omnipresence of technology in kind of disturbing ways is yet another. And those are key ingredients of the original Cyberpunk 2013, and the sort of the genre materials that we were drawing from. But when I look at the world today, I see lots of different and interesting ways to kind of remix those same ideas and come up with sort of different flavors of cyberpunk, that can be fun to toy with, I guess, is
Yeah.
where I land.
So for me, yeah, I definitely see now that we live in the future, right? Now that we live in 2020, 2023, and the idea that was postulated back in the 80s and 90s, seeing, and granted, I don't see the technology as rampant. I mean, it's different, but I don't see it as rampant as I would have saw it back in the 80s and 90s, right? So we had a conversation a little bit before the stream, was how we view the low life high tech.
This is one other ingredient I didn't mention, which was that
Right,
the protagonists are kind of outside of society.
right, and the corporations definitely. I mean, look at what corporations are now today. They're their own person. I mean, who would have thought that, right? That some governments would recognize a corporation as a individual, which is mind-boggling. The one thing you haven't gotten right is the corporate security or armies. We do have
Well,
the.
I was thinking about
We're
that
getting
because we
close.
did. I mean,
We're getting very
we did
I
close.
mean, we
we
have
did
them.
we saw the
Monsanto
rise of the
bought
privatized
Blackwater.
military contractors, right? Exactly, Blackwater. And I thought that I kind of feel like they're maybe not to the scale, or now Wagner Group in Russia,
Yeah.
looming large. I don't know that we got the scale right. They're not big in the way that we imagined them, but I think we got the idea right,
Oh,
which is kind of
definitely.
spooky. But
And I totally agree with that. I mean, even now there's proposals from various corporations like we're going to create a community, and those who will join our community, you'll be our employees, and we're going to work with you, and you can see that next step that eventually is going to come.
I mean, you can almost judge how pure a cyberpunk media is by how disenfranchised the protagonist is by the world around it.
Yep.
yeah, I think that's true.
And I think
That's
this.
why, and I think that's why I throw out things like Parasite as being like cyberpunk media.
Yeah.
Because it's about sort of marginal characters, sort of finding their way in a kind of stratified society in sort of ingenious and slightly violent ways.
Yeah. I mean, and and not a lot of people mention certain movies that I've often taken as this is very cyberpunk. And there was a couple of series that HBO did, which was Barbarians at the Gate, which was a novel before, which basically talked about the rise of R.J. Reynolds.
It was right. It was
Yeah.
Yeah,
the attempted hostile takeover. I remember that.
yeah,
James Garner.
yes. So that movie to me totally epitomized corporate world cyberpunk, right? You add in certain strike teams and black ops teams to that, and boom, you got a cyberpunk game, right?
I
Or a
think that's I
cyberpunk
think that's
campaign.
absolutely right.
Then there was a sequel, which was Weapons of Mass Distraction, which was basically about two corporate CEOs who were trying to buy a sports team. And they were two media giants, right? And what they did to kind of discredit each other, that was another totally, especially from a cyberpunk genre of two megacorps warring with each other to get a sports team, right? If you haven't seen it,
But
I don't know if it's available at all, but it's a great movie to when it comes to the manipulation of a megacorp, right? And how they, especially a media megacorp, and how they would wage war with each other.
Yeah, I think that is also right. And I think one of the fun things about cyberpunk and imagining it is often you're kind of looking at stuff in the world now. Again, the idea all science fiction is really about the present. And with cyberpunk, it's often just looking at what's in the world and then kind of adding a layer of violence and turning it up to 11,
Right.
and then you're good to go. And I think about this in terms of, so here's another cyberpunk movie I'll put out there. Um, and I've mentioned this a few times, and I usually get blank stares, so go with me here. But there's a documentary about live streaming culture in China called The People's Republic of Desire, and it's about all of these live. It's a movie from about a documentary from about 4 or 5 years ago, done by a guy named Wu Hao, and and the live streamers, they're running stables by managers, and they make their money by being given sort of gifts and donations by their audience, and they're under huge pressure to be online all the time, and they compete with each other, and the stars do really well, and people just like destroy their lives, trying to do this. And I remember watching that movie and think this movie is like one layer of gang violence and some extractions away from being like a cyberpunk story. Like it's that close. I often think, and this is because I lived there for a long time, but I think in many ways China is like the most cyberpunk country today, not Japan, just because of the way technological society has kind of risen up in interesting ways from the grassroots in China. Um, and this live streaming thing was one example of that. And I thought it's so close. It's so close to being true cyberpunk. It's like just a little violence and some 84s away. Um, and
I mean,
there's
it's
lots of
China. The
stuff like
violence
that out
always
there.
comes.
Well, I mean, I managed to live there for 8 years without too much trouble, but the air was definitely rough.
Yeah.
Well, so we want to get a little bit back to some of our questions, specifically around 2020, because I love the conversation that we're having. And like I said, I think we're probably going to have you on to do a little bit of a deeper dive after you played 2077.
Indeed.
So were you able to? So back in the day, right, when Mike was actually creating Cyberpunk, did you actually play in his games? And if so, what characters did you play? If you did,
Ooh,
if you
we
remember.
definitely played. I mean, good God. I'm sure that we did, because we were sort of test driving it, but a bunch of people ran games at various times, and I'm sure Mike did. I should have pulled it out. I must have like my characters around somewhere, and I think my default character was, because I was boring and unoriginal, was a solo. I don't know. I might have the binder handy. Let me go see if I can dig them out while we're talking. I have an amazing amount of this stuff that still exists and sits around in folders. Um,
Yeah, it's been a recurring theme with these interviews that we're trying to track down, who created what characters that became the legacy characters. Obviously, all the adventure source books you wrote, those are all yours, but uh, yeah, it's this sort of lore that we live for, these backroom
well, let's see.
stories.
I can find my high school D&D character sheet, and brilliant illustration done of him by my old buddy Sam Liu. Later went on to be an animation director. No, I cannot find my punt characters anywhere. They must have vanished into the mist of time. I will tell you that my default character was probably a solo. I have some memories of the character sheet, because we all wanted to be action heroes, and
Oh
we were
yeah.
all also watching Arnold Schwarzenegger movies at the time, which was probably, they had probably too big of an impact on us. But yeah, like Mike definitely used to run games. I have clearer memories of playing teenagers with Mike than I have of playing Cyberpunk with Mike. I got to say, And that may just be because teenager games were like so loony that like they just made a bigger impression. Yeah, I can't find the character sheet. It was worth a look. I did find my dice box recently, which is in very bad shape.
The old dice.
Oh
Oh,
my
I bet
God,
they
it's the
still work
same
these
box
days.
from the 1980s where because I was infatuated with Japan, I had written the word dice in katakana on the top in Sharpie, which is still there. It's kind of embarrassing. It's a bit cringe in retrospect, but there it was. I was like 17. What do you want?
Oh, dude, yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I used to draw my own cassette tape covers.
That's excellent. I will definitely I support that. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think Mike did run games. We definitely played. I remember playing. I remember playing teenagers. I remember playing Dream Park games because we all had to kind of get our heads around the idea, which was a little weird. Uh, um, but I would struggle to remember any specific campaigns. It's just too long ago.
That makes sense. I mean, yeah, we're asking you to dig deep here. Um, yeah. Uh,
I'm trying to remember if I ever played C.J. O'Reilly as a character, and I created him mostly as an NPC. And I if I'd known what was good for me, I would have played him as a character. But I can't recall if I did or did not.
So we have one question around CJ Raleigh. So you said he uses him as an NPC. I wasn't sure if you create him as like a narrator because we talked with Ben Wright around Adam Smasher, right? And his invention of Adam Smasher was just a quick narrator as opposed to an NPC or a PC. So was CJ Raleigh an NPC that you actually ran games for or you use in your games?
Well, I think he was a character that popped up. I don't think he was ever like a central character in a game, and I didn't run many games. I never considered myself a very good, funny because I wrote a lot of supplements, but Teenagers was the only game I thought I was a kind of natural game master for, and I ran like sort of champions, top secret games, and sort of back in the day, and I never thought I was that good at it. And the people who were really good at it had a certain improvisational ability. I had friends who were just so much better at it. I was like, I'm going to play. I'm going to let them do the game mastering. Some of them were my writing buddies at RTG. So CJ was invented first and foremost to be a narrator and a way of setting up situations, particularly like the whole sort of Latin America conflict situation. And he was a war correspondent character, but he was created to be sort of gonzo. But the idea was also that he could be an NPC. He was somebody who could always serve as a guide, in those landscapes if needed.
it's funny that you mentioned that GMing wasn't really your thing because you wrote two of the best like campaign source books I've ever seen, Tales from the Forlorn Hope and Land of the Free. Um,
Well, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. By the way, if you hunt around in Land of the Free, you should find NPCs named for what was then the entire offensive line of the San Francisco 49ers, um, uh, um, possibly with minor changes for legal reasons, but they're in there. Yeah, I mean, like making up a story and creating the spine of a story. Like I like doing that, and I'm fairly good at it, I hope. But I think it's one thing to construct the elements kind of with the luxury of time, and it's a very it's a skill to manage a group of players and then to use those ingredients in the moment to create something original that incorporates what the players are doing. And I'm very deliberate, like I arrive at conclusions by talking about them, and I write and then I rewrite stuff and I remix it and I rethink it because, anxiety. But I think there are people, whether it's their own materials or whether they're taking campaign materials and using them as a basis, who are very good at that in the moment work with players and relating to players. And what they create is not what's in the source book. I mean, my theory is like what they create is a combination of what's in the source book and the story they tell around the actions their characters take. And what I discovered when I was running games, whether my own supplements or with other supplements and other game systems, is I become too much a slave to the material. And I was better at
I've been
like
there.
coming up with the ingredients and putting them out in the world for other people to do what they wanted with than I was in like running the games myself. So if other people took those ingredients and like ran great campaigns, even if they changed and remixed stuff, I couldn't be happier. That's great. But I don't have a problem like with audiences or anything like that. But I was never the most skilled at that remix it in the moment aspect that I think separates a really good game master from like a so-so game master. And I was a terrible game master. I was a so-so game master.
Well, speaking of Forlorn Hope, which I've got two questions related to this. Forlorn
Pull them
Hope.
off the shelf because now I'm not going to remember. Hang on. Okay, got it.
Oh, okay, Forlorn Hope.
And landed the free while we're at it.
Yeah, there you go. Um, One of the core members of the bar, the wife of the owner, Marion Russell Freeman, was a transgender character who, as I said, ran the bar, and that was years ahead of its time. Other than When Gravity Fails, which you also, wrote the source book for, that was the first time that I'd ever seen a transgender character in a role-playing game. Cyberpunk
So,
2077 features a transgender bartender named Claire Russell.
so I did not know that. I will tell you
Sorry to spoil that for
that
you, but
no, it's fine. It's good. Good for them. I don't know if Marianne was my creation or Frank Fry's creation because I was, like Frank had conceived a lot of the sort of ingredients and then I wrote the stories around them. And
okay.
C.J. O'Reilly is definitely my creation. And I don't know if I created Marianne or he created Marianne. It could have been either of us. I will say, and I forgot if she was transgender, but I'm super happy that she is. I mean, I grew up in the Castro in San Francisco and in the 70s. And, like there was just a kind of certain freakiness in the air that I don't know. I used to walk through that neighborhood on my way home from the school bus like every day, and it just was part of the background. And I like to think that I fairly, that I'm just, like people can be who or what they want to be, and that's fine. So like whether it was Frank or me, good for us because I think, I think I don't think that's anything to get too weirded out about. Like that is the way people are in the world. There are transgender
Amen.
people in the world. They're part of the background. They should be treated as people and related to as such. So if a certain number of characters are trans, fantastic. So I'm glad we did that. I wish I could remember the antecedents, but I'd love to take credit for it. Maybe I can.
Well, I mean, that you have directly inspired, or yeah, direct inspiration of the storyline you wrote went on to live on in the video game.
Good.
Uh,
Well, that's good. And I also think like, look, you have to look at the ethos of cyberpunk, right? Like, it's funny that I don't know. I wonder if anybody was like, well, that sucks and got offended by it. But like, in Cyberpunk, we talk about like the most extreme modifications of one's body by technology. And
Oh yeah.
I think like, like if you can if you can comprehend a game, or if you can accept a game that comprehends the idea that you are going to replace chunks of your body with machinery, why can't you comprehend, a world in which we could refashion their gender identity as well as their physical, or mechanical identity?
Absolutely.
I think the positive way to look at the technology thing, I mean, I think in a lot of ways it was spooky, like the idea that you were sort of replacing your humanity in certain ways. But a more positive way to look at it is the technology is a way to express how you imagine yourself in the world, right? Like whatever you do to your body fulfills your vision of who you are. This is maybe something that edgerunners got right in terms of the obsession of the main character with modifying himself. I mean, gender expression is like on that continuum as well. And if you can be free to choose, your, the mechanical component of your body, you can be free to choose the gender component of your body, or to adapt your body to match the gender that is in your head. And I think that is, this is a universe where people are
Or to the ethos.
reimagining their whole selves. So why not?
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. My second question about Forlorn Hope is uh, all throughout your writing, you throw out numerous homages and Easter eggs to, pop culture, particularly anime or science fiction. With Forlorn Hope, you obviously had the
That sounds
dirty
like
pair in
me.
there with Roxy and Kissy.
Yeah,
Uh,
for sure.
what if any were the influences, if you remember, for the other characters that appear in the book? Some of them I've been able to, like, I can guess at,
Yeah.
but
The only one I remember is C.J. O'Reilly because he was based on P.J. O'Rourke, the humorist, who we read when we were in college and thought was
that
hysterical.
makes so much
Um,
sense.
and his name, C.J. O'Reilly, is a pretty obvious, like connection.
Yeah,
So he was based on a real person, and his kind of gonzo tone was my, extremely crafty attempt to sort of capture something of P.J. O'Reilly's voice. But remember. I don't remember the origins of the other characters, but I will tell you that like I was always putting in, that's why I remember like the offensive line of the 49ers being in Land of the Free. I also had a character whose name was a kind of bowdlerized translation of the French for pain in the ass.
mm,
Like I loved those little jokes, and I, like as you can probably tell from this conversation, like I do enjoy pop culture and I like to think about it. And I think it's fun to kind of embed homages and links to the things that have influenced us. And I mean, definitely Dirty Pair. It's funny because I mean, the Dirty Pair series was great, but one of my all-time favorite animes is the Crusher Joe movie, which is the first appearance of
oh yeah.
Dirty Pair as a kind of afterthought, as the movie they're
Hmm.
watching in the movie, and that's kind of actually always what I think too when Dirty Pair is mentioned.
Okay.
Thank you. I've always wondered about that.
So you created Arasaka. Was it a collaboration, or did you have free reign when it came to creating Arasaka with Mike?
No, I just did it out of whole cloth. It wasn't a collaboration. I mean, like obviously, it's had a life after that, and people have layers have been added to it, and it's been remixed and rethought by many people, which is great. But like, I still have the. I mean, like. I'm not even sure I knew that it was going to be part of the game. I at the time I was writing it. Uh, um, I just, I just and I can't even remember what made me want to write it at the time, and whether Mike was like, "We need a thing," or whether I was just because I was like, this while I was in college, and like I was a huge Japanophile. I had read the well, I was reading a lot of Japanese history, ancient and contemporary, and absorbing a lot of Japanese pop culture. And as I mentioned, like the American neurosis at the time was like Japanese companies were going to take over the world. So it wasn't a big leap to be like, well, I need to do a sort of Japanese Daibatsu alpha villain character. But like so much of the origins of Arasaka were drawn from like my kind of like sort of elements of my personal experience. So uh, the and it's funny, like the idea that the sort of the security corporation is as a way to like, and private military corporation as a way to like siphon information was too one dimensional, but it was a good start. Um, but the name Arasaka is so my buddy Scott Ruggles, who was an illustrator in for well, he was a high school buddy of mine, and then he became an illustrator for RTG, and then later went on to go do computer graphics for games. Um, he owned a Japanese Arisaka World War II rifle, which was the source of the name of the corporation. But the backstory for the founder of the Arasaka Corporation, Saburo Arasaka, was like I essentially lifted it from not lifted. That's too unkind to myself. It was very heavily inspired by the autobiography of a Japanese, redundant, a Zero pilot in World War II named Saburo Sakai, who wrote an autobiography that's a great read if you can find it. It's called Samurai, and kind of his experiences in the war as a pilot, and so, Saburo Sakai to Saburo Arasaka, the World War II pilot who dreams of restoring Japanese greatness and does so through, his kind of singular focus on building this company that can be, that can funnel information, the weapon of the future in his direction from myriad sources. Like, it was not a hard thing to conceive of given the ingredients of the time, I think. And
I
I don't know. It's funny. It's great. It's gratifying that it's loomed in people's imaginations for 35 years now.
that makes so much more sense. I always thought the name Sabaru came from Seburo, the arms manufacturer in the Shiroverse stuff, Appleseed, Ghost in the
No,
Shell.
straight up name for Saburo Sakai, the
That makes
pilot,
so
the
much
little
more
guy,
sense. Actually, I imagine
and aligned
Seburo is
with I
probably
don't know.
inspired by that as well.
Maybe. And then like the backstory, like the whole pilot backstory is just like, yeah, is Saburo Sakai, who,
Yeah,
I would like to point out became an author and not a corporate mega villain. So I don't want to misremember him, but I still have a copy of Samurai around somewhere. My son, who's an aviation nut, read it and super enjoyed it. It's a good book.
I
Um,
will have to seek that out.
so yeah, those were the ingredients that kind of came together, and I think, and I never really thought about this, but if I have to analyze why Arasaka lives on, um, part of it is because it was a bit of a blank slate. Like a lot of the other mega corporations were sort of pigeonholed into very specific areas or industrial domains, right? Like Militech was Militech, and Savoil was Savoil, and like and Petrochem was Petrochem. Like, but Arasaka could be anything you wanted it to be. You could
Yeah,
like it was very easy to remold it into whatever you needed, and then of course because it was Japanese and that plugged into the sort of pop culture ethos that Cyberpunk was rooted in, that was like a little extra sprinkling of spice on top, I think. And if I had to psychoanalyze why it lives on when the other megacorps that we created kind of fell by the wayside, that might be where I would land.
Well, it's also like, hey, beware the men in black, right? And that
I
kind
mean,
of
it's such a
pattern.
perfect, yeah, it's such a perfect representation of the cyberpunk corporation, like this giant megalithic, their hands and everything, like you said, just
Yeah, and
Zaibatsu.
you sort of whisper their name, and people's, like the hair on the back of people's necks stands up. Like that was sort of the idea, or that's what it grew into. Like I put a lot of thought into the design document for Arasaka, which is like 12 pages long. It's like longer than what I actually wrote into the corp book. Um, but that was mostly because like I was like having a good time writing it. But I do think like my original idea for them was much more one dimensional, and it was that blank slate character that has enabled people to kind of reinvent it and refashion it for all in different incarnations of cyberpunk, which is great. I think like that makes me I mean it's not a as a creative person it's not a terrible legacy that people keep on reworking and reusing this thing. Um, why not?
Yeah, I mean it's
Except, of course, it's funny that like the corporations people are worried about now are not Japanese corporations. They are, well, mostly domestic ones, and maybe to a degree, at least from an American political standpoint, Chinese ones.
Yeah,
Poor old
definitely,
TikTok.
definitely, mostly the domestic stuff though. Really, is mostly the agricultural and food industries that I worry about.
I thought one of them
Well, you
was
can have a lot of fun, and I'm sure that they have been. I mean, like they do make. I mean, well, so if you want to talk about a frisson of fear, anything that involves bioengineering, because I remember the the sort of moral panic over genetically engineered crops, right? Like, you can have a lot of fun with bioengineered agriculture, and well, that's. So speaking of Bong Joon-ho and cyberpunk movies, that's Okja, right? Like,
Yeah,
or Okja, the giant pig movie.
yeah, I know what you're talking about. And yeah, it's
Find it on Netflix,
okay.
folks.
Um, so you
It's
co-wrote and
also it's also because food, you put it in your body, so it's a great place to get into like the horrors. Speaking of cyberpunk movies, Soylent Green.
yeah.
yeah,
I was going
yeah,
to mention that earlier, like the various technically sci-fi movies back in the day, and like Rollerblade, uh, Silent Green or Soylent Green, and there was quite a few that kind of like hallmarked the whole dark future of the world that you can get into.
yeah. Even
Yeah,
like
I mean,
proto dystopian movies like Logan's Run and
I had
things of
Logan's Run
that.
on my list. I didn't mention it, but I think of that as a cyberpunk movie for sure.
I do too.
And
So
I mean, it's a journey. Like the journey in Logan's Run is interesting because he starts as an insider in the society and becomes an outsider, sort of rebelling against its strictures. But I think that idea of a kind of confined and anesthetized, mass culture is a very that's a very cyberpunk idea to me.
indeed, I think a lot of people like sleep on these older movies because they there seems to be this prevailing thought that if something came out before uh, a term was coined, that it doesn't like still fall under that term. Like there are people who will say that Blade Runner isn't cyberpunk because the word cyberpunk hadn't been created yet.
It's
And
totally cyberpunk.
I mean,
It's
it's
like it's so
the
cyberpunk that when
blueprint.
we went to Singapore in 1995 and I was cutting together a video explaining what we were doing, Blade Runner was definitely one of the movies I grabbed, shots from to explain like the core ideas we were and the aesthetic, like the aesthetic of Blade Runner is as I would say was like
It's
first of all, the source book is an important part of the canon. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And then, like the look of Blade Runner influenced everything that came afterwards in Cyberpunk. So I think like it's it's dumb to be a purist about that.
yeah, I agree. It's in fact the blueprint for Cyberpunk. Like it is the basis upon which all other visual media of Cyberpunk, was built on.
Absolutely. The skyline, the giant ads with Japanese women on them, the kind of grungy street level life, the sense of a stratified society.
I mean, if
Yeah.
you really want to go back, you can go back to 1937's Metropolis by Fritz Lang. That's really the
I
first
think
cyberpunk media there ever was.
well, it's definitely a very creepy science fiction movie. Metropolis is great. I haven't watched it for a long time. I should go back and rewatch it. But I remember just thinking as I was watching it how amazing the visual aesthetic of it was, and and just like how ahead of his time as a sort of visual stylist Fritz Lang was. But I agree with that call. I think Metropolis is good. So I mean, this was something I want to get back to this idea of canon, because I think you can, you know, I like a lot of, like Star Wars came out when I was 9. It was like a big impact on my life. I've brought it in, I've kind of raised my son to appreciate it and to be. I took him to see Return of the Jedi and Revival last weekend, because it was on the big screen. These are like super important to me. I think, fandoms are churches, and the word canon is a religious word, right? It's a body of religious law as a canon, and I think
Yeah.
When we talk about these worlds, we can kind of be slaves to canon, and you can have arguments about what's canon and what isn't canon, and that definitely happens in Cyberpunk.
Oh
Um,
yeah, it does.
and look, I think it's great if you want to play a game of canonical RPG Cyberpunk and like work with the universe, as it is laid out for you, or you want to debate sort of spin-off media and like how authentic it is to the canon or not. But these are first and foremost creative endeavors, right? Like Cyberpunk itself is a remix. Like we were remixing a bunch of media that came before, like to make Cyberpunk. And I think it's fine. Like, who cares about canon? Like, I think if you have a creative idea and you want to take a universe into an orthogonal direction or do something different with it, or if there's a piece of media that takes it in a different direction, that's fine. Be open to that, and you can decide what you want to use or incorporate or not. But I think it's like music, like all music builds on the music that came before. And I think these fictional worlds and these, they build upon the worlds that come before, and they're meant to be feedstock for creativity. And I think it's fine to play with them and to remix them and rethink them. And they're just ingredients. And so I'm like, I don't want to get too hung up on canon. I want people to have a good time and do something I never would have dreamed of with Arasaka. Make them the good guys. I don't care. Like it's fine. There are lots of interesting ideas to play with. I don't think people should limit themselves.
It's funny you should say that because typically Arasaka isn't the villain in my games. Like it's just not. They're at anything they're neutral. They don't care about you. They're
well, I think they're kind of more interesting as atmosphere. I mean, I think
yeah.
as conceived, the idea that you were sort of go head to head with Arasaka is like, well, you're going to be dead, so why would you do that? But I think as a kind of part of the atmosphere, they can be super effective.
Not to drag us back on course, but there's a question I've been wanting to ask you. You co-wrote and edited the When Gravity Fails source book based off the novel by Alec Effinger. How closely did you work with him when creating the source book?
So I think Mike was the connection back to Alec. I've always heard all three together, George, Alec, Effinger.
Yeah,
sorry. And he had a role. I mean, like he definitely had like creative oversight to make sure we weren't screwing up his vision. I don't remember. Like I think we had pretty free reign. Like I read the novel first and like made sure I had the world in my head. I enjoyed it too. I thought it was a pretty good read.
Oh yeah.
And and I think like we kind of understood the rules, me and Dave and Chris and uh, um, both Chris's, and I I don't like he wasn't involved in like the stuff we were writing. I think he had an editing task to make sure that we had like trashed his world, um, and I met him. I might have been at one of the conventions, but I didn't know him well. And my principal homework was like reading and digesting the novel and like making
Okay,
sure that I had a sense of the world he was trying to build so that we could be faithful to it.
that's awesome. Yeah,
And you
I've
do want
always
to be
been curious
faithful to
about
it.
that
Like
because
I think so. I say you don't want to be a slave to canon, but also if an artist has been kind enough to allow you to build on his work, you don't want to piss on his vision either.
right. Yeah, I was always curious about it
But
because I know Walter John Williams was heavily involved with the hardwired source book. So I was just wondering if it was the same type situation.
yeah, and I think of him as being more around in a way or more visible. Although that might have just been like in emails or in things that
Wait,
Mike was saying or uh,
emails were
um,
back in the 89, 90.
uh, how are we communicating? I'm wondering if I don't know if I had email in '89. That's a good question.
It's hard to remember
It's
the
a
Probably
time
very
actually
weird
because
era, when you're thinking back with
I
your
think I didn't
technology.
have my own email account until I was in graduate school in 1992. Might have been when I had it when I got my first email account. So I don't know. Angry phone calls sitting around the table. I think that the conventions were kind of places where a lot of the headbanging happened because we were all in the same place at the same time, which was not always something that happened. Um, uh, but I think, I mean, Gravity was interesting because it was just such a different take, like the location and the way he was thinking about technology, and it was a kind of different feel than the sort of classic cyberpunk we were doing in a number of different ways, and that made it fun. And it was all fun, but I think it's probably one we don't revisit enough, just because it really was a very original take and a really different cyberpunk world. It'd probably be considered cultural appropriation today, but I think it was very original.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean it was the
I
it
mean,
was the
I guess
first
it's no
time I'd ever
weirder than us.
seen. At least
Sorry, you
it
were
was the
saying.
first
Go ahead.
time since Dune that I had seen, Arabic Middle Eastern culture represented like that in science fiction. So it was again like
Yeah,
ahead of
and
its
that's such
time.
an interesting culture, and part of the world. And like I guess it's no weirder than like us trying to appropriating a bunch of like Japan for the original cyberpunk. But it was a really interesting idea, and it's funny. We were talking about movies. When I think about the technology he created for that book, The Bodies and Daddies, that reminds me of Strange Days, which was another movie we didn't
Yeah.
mention.
Yep.
That's another kind of foundational genre movie. I haven't watched that one since it came out. I should probably go rewatch it.
Well, even looking at.
It's
Oh, go ahead.
fantastic.
Yes.
I was yeah.
But talking
But
about
this
the.
is a good. I think this.
Go ahead.
So go you first.
Well, I was going to get into the whole, even you back in the day were talking, or even with Gravity Falls, bring in the Arabic thing. Now, even today, you see the projects that Arabian countries and nations are having towards building a more modern city and a more modern environment. It's astounding how much they're getting into becoming cyberpunk, right? Or at least from an
So
environment.
you're thinking of like Neom in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very cyberpunk project if it indeed comes together. It's got all the ingredients. So this is a good point. One of the things that
Well,
I
I've been
really
looking at
enjoy
Dubai
about
right now.
Yeah, Dubai is, or Singapore, where I lived for a long time, which was used as the backdrop for the Westworld TV series because it looked like a futuristic city in a way that American cities didn't.
Yeah.
Not all of Singapore is futuristic, but a lot of it is.
Mm.
But I think this is interesting, and I mean, come back to what made When Gravity Fails kind of fun and different. You know, the original Cyberpunk is, like it is mostly Americentric because we were all Americans, and even as it relates to Japan, we were relating to Japan as like through the lens of American neurosis, right? Like not as its own thing. Um, and one of the things I appreciate about like Netflix and the streaming services, especially Netflix, is that there's a huge amount of like foreign material on it,
Yeah.
and you know, um, we have found, I mean, like Korean stuff for sure. Obviously, Squid Games, another cyberpunk show, um, uh, but very interesting to watch, like thrillers and material from other cultures. Like, go watch if you haven't the Indian thriller Sacred Games, which is not really cyberpunk, but also kind of is.
It's
And
adjacent.
sort of, yeah, it's adjacent, right? And and you could easily sort of extrapolate once again a cyberpunk story from it. And I think it's really interesting to like pull in different cultures. And that's one reason why I fixate on China, because I have direct experience with it. And I've seen a lot there that I'm like, this is really cyberpunk. But I think there are very interesting ways to come at these genre ideas from different cultures. And that was the success of When Gravity Fails, 30 years ago, ahead of its time in that respect. Like the Middle East is a really interesting area, and there's a bunch of really interesting cultures, and I think it's fun to see these ideas kind of emerge through the lenses of different cultures with their own sets of neuroses.
I like
Yeah.
the I like the action films coming out of Indonesia this last 10 years with
Oh
the
yeah, we
rise
just
of
watched one. What was it?
EcoUI.
It was a riot. Yeah, we just
Uh,
watched an
the
Indonesian
Night
action
Comes for
film. It was
Us.
a
I just
trip.
watched that last night.
I can't remember. It definitely made me think I had to hunt up more. I remember how obsessed we got with the Hong Kong action thrillers of the 80s, the
Yeah,
John Woo movies, just because they created this entirely new vocabulary of action film, and how they were paced and how the action worked. And, I think they were hugely influential for cyberpunk as
I do
well.
too.
I just like, I think I go back and I look at like Hard Boiled or The Killer and the character archetypes there, or Bullet in the Head, like that, these things are like pure cyberpunk, but they
I
bring
mean,
all their own kind of cultural lens.
to to this day, Better Tomorrow 2 is still the best shoot 'em up movie I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's up there. And of course, he was remixing based on Peckinpah and like American influences that came before him.
Yeah,
Again, this is like where you have to not be a slave to canon. Like all of this stuff is accreted. Um, but those movies
everything's got an
were great.
influence.
Yeah, and it was very interesting to watch that sensibility percolate into Hollywood and form the bedrock of how we rethink about action, clear up to and through like the John Wick movies, also
Yeah,
cyberpunk. Uh,
very.
um, and to trace these lineages and to think about how they relate to the genres, I find it to be a huge amount of fun.
Yep.
It
So,
is. It is a good way to kill a Sunday afternoon. That's for sure.
No doubt.
um, we're about 20 minutes from where we're going to stop, but so I just want to, and I'm sure we're going to enjoy this story. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I definitely want to ask it, and I think you've headed towards it. Can you talk about the cyberpunk video game that never saw the light of day back in '95?
You bet. So I where's the best place to start? So I used to go to Gen Con every year with Mike and the crew, and we would run games and work the booth and have a good time. And those were trips were a huge amount of fun. We would go eat ludicrously huge German meals and go drink at the cheap bars. And I felt like a grown up. Like I was young, but like they were such a good time. And it was only Milwaukee, which is like not exactly an exotic city, but I had a good time.
Beer
And
capital of America.
right, well, so there you go. And we played a lot of Doom in those days. Doom had come out, and my buddy Dave, who was also an RPG contributor, had gone to work for Capcom, the video game company, and we would go. He would sneak us into the office after hours, and you would get on the PCs, which were all DOS, and you had to boot them into the LAN. They didn't connect automatically, and then you could run Doom, and you could play Doom on the network, and it was wild. Like we'd never done anything like that. We would play Doom death matches till like all hours. We had a lot of fun playing Doom, and played way too much for our health. And so I was out at Gen Con in like 1994 or three, I forget which one, and this guy had a booth, and he was selling a Doom level editor. He had a company called Renegade Graphics, and the product he was selling there was a level editor from Doom on floppy disk. So you go build your own Doom levels. And I was like, oh, that seems fun. And so I was, I was having a chat with him, and I ended up trading him some Cyberpunk books for a copy of his software, and took it home and was building Doom levels, which was great fun. And he and I started corresponding, and I guess we did have email in those days. Yeah, we must have, because we were emailing each other, and because this was like '93, so we were definitely on email, and we had a lot of shared interests, and so he got a book contract to do a book on games on the commercial online services, and wrote me in as his co-writer, and we co-wrote this book together on games. This is like Genie, the GE Network, and Prodigy, CompuServe, AOL, right? Like we wrote this book on games on the commercial online services, circa 1993. And we wrote a follow-up book on games on the early internet. Some of them come out in like late '94 or the very beginning of '95. So like super proto-internet, because I started farting around with the web in like '94 when I was in grad school. I was doing broadcasting in the internet version. I was like, this seems interesting. Seems a lot more interesting than broadcasting.
So sorry to interrupt you. Was
And
that Raw Shaw?
was that what?
So there's a book called The Complete Internet Gamer by Will Moss and Ron Shaw.
Oh, so yeah, it's Joe Pantuso
Oh, okay.
is the person I'm talking about here, and the other book is called Online Games, with a very clever, A in a circle like an email at in the games, because that was, in the year this came out, that was still a novel idea, not a tired and incredibly hackney. Yeah, that was, so it's copyright, both of them are copyright '95. Um, nope. The internet one came out in '96, so we turned it in '95, and it came out in '96. And so Joe Pantuso was the guy, and we did these books. And Joe had some friends who had done like an engine, a text-based engine, game engine, and and I was an audiovisual guy doing sound editing and sound effects as I worked in radio. And so Joe, we started working on some little game projects. He sent me a copy of some 3D modeling software, and we were kind of dorking around. And so then and I saw him again the following year at Gen Con, and so I'd like seen him face to face twice, and we were mostly buddies online. And so in August of 1995, he emails me, and he's like, hey, some guys from Singapore have contacted me about a game operation they want to start up, and they want to bring me out there to talk about it. You want to come out with me? And I'd graduated from grad school. I was 6 months out of grad school when this happened, to work in producing talk radio on part time on the weekends and writing for Mike during the weeks, and starving to death slowly, and because neither paid well. And
Starving artist.
I was like, sure, because it sounded crazy. Like, yeah, we're going to go to Singapore, like, and meet with these guys. That seems like bullshit. And so I said, yeah, that would be great. I would love to. And it happened. They flew us out to Singapore, and so I went I flew to Joe's house in Tennessee, and I spent like a few days with him, and we kind of workshopped our pitch to these guys. And the original idea was not Cyberpunk. It was a different game. It was a kind of more anime kind of combat game, like robot stuff. And we went out to pitch to them, and amazingly enough, it went well because we were like, I cannot stress enough, idiots, right? Like in way over our heads. And so we went out and we pitched these game concepts to these guys in Singapore. We flew 8,000 miles on their dollar to Singapore, a place I'd never been and had no picture of in my head. I remember reading like the photo's guide on the airplane, so I didn't, do something stupid. And we met with these guys. They worked for a company called Sembawang Media. It was the first big internet company in Singapore. They found Joe online, and they decided he was their guy for reasons I don't understand. And Joe had brought me along as a number two. We went out, we pitched them, and they said, "This is great. We love it. We want to do more." And we thought, like, well, what else can we do? And we thought about the cyberpunk thing. So we thought, okay, we can do a game based on cyberpunk. And we went and we talked to Mike. We said, Mike, look, we'd like to license Cyberpunk to do a game. And nobody had done one, and Mike was into the idea. And I think we paid him $10,000, or rather, Sembawang Media paid him $10,000 to license the rights to Cyberpunk. So we had the game rights to Cyberpunk, and that in November, Joe and I moved back to Singapore. They moved us back to Singapore along with four of our friends from the U.S., including my buddy Mike McDonald, who is another RTG contributor that I brought along specifically to work on the Cyberpunk stuff. And we had a mission to build both this kind of combat game and also a Cyberpunk massively multiplayer online game. And that was what we set out to do. And we hired a team of like 20 bright young Singaporean artists and software developers. And we set about trying to make these games and failed so miserably. I mean, just we're in so far over our heads and like had no idea how to relate to, Singaporean bosses. We did a pretty good job with our staff, who were so talented and deserved so much better than they got from us. And we were well-meaning, and I still have a lot of the materials, the art, the concept, and we did a lot of work, but it just we fought war after war after war with our bosses, and we were expensive, and we were kind of arrogant and stupid. And when they started running into money trouble after about 8 or 9 months, and started looking around for like noisy, expensive loudmouths to cut, we were very close to the top of the list. So the whole project lasted 14 months, and then they just fired us all. And Mike McDonald and I both stayed in Singapore, and we joined another startup where we worked for several years. And I ended up staying in Asia for 17 years as a result of this. Met my wife in Singapore and lived there, and lived in China, and came back to the US 10 years ago. But I think back on that experience super fondly. We really meant well, and so, we had a lot of ideas, but we could not execute. We were just too inexperienced and in over our heads, and they could smell it, after the first few months, and so we were doomed. And the funny thing is, that was the end. When that crashed, that was like the end of my fantasy gaming and video gaming both. Not on purpose. It's just I kind of stopped after that and was doing other things. I was working in another internet startup and did that until the .com collapsed, and then I got into doing technology comms, which is what I do to this day. And life changed. But that was the story. We tried to do this, and we spent like $1.5 million and failed utterly.
Well, and for our younger listeners, I think, was it back in 95, 96, if I remember correctly, they actually published a book, like a phone book, of all the internet sites, right?
It's hard to express to people who weren't there at the time how clunky and weird the internet was in 1995. If you were styling, you dialed up with like a 44.1 modem, had to listen to
Well, cutting edge would be
stuff,
2880, right?
All the noises. I think we were a little faster at that point. You could get faster than that, but not much. And I remember I still have the receipt for the computer I bought in May '95 after I graduated from grad school, and I treated myself to this computer. I bought it from Micron, who made computers in those days. You like, it's going to blow your minds. I mean, you may remember these days, but like, it was the second PC I bought. I bought a 486 in like '92.
Yep.
I used Macs when I was in college. I had like an original Mac when I was in college, and then PCs were the computers you could game on. And so I bought a 486, and then in '95 I bought this computer. Check it out. It had a Pentium 100, had
Okay.
a 1 gigabyte hard drive. It had
Oh
maybe
man, you were rolling.
8 or 16 megabytes of RAM.
It was
It
probably
had a
8.
Diamond Stealth 4 megabyte video card, a Creative Sound card, and it had, this was
Diamond
like the really
Stealth.
bitching part, a 100 megabyte tape backup. Check that out. And
Jesus,
and
man,
it
you
came
were
with a,
tip top.
I was balling. And it had I bought it with a 14-inch Nokia branded Trinitron monitor, which was also like, that was some sick shit in those days. Anybody want to guess how much this computer cost me at that time?
About $4,000.
Yeah.
Very close. $5,000. It cost me almost
Ooh.
exactly $5,000. I had to split it over 2 credit cards, which was dumb.
For something that today is outpowered by your phone in every way.
I have like my thermostat outpowers that computer, and
Yeah.
but like I was so pleased with that computer. I had it shipped to Singapore, and I used it until 2004 when I moved to China. Like it after it outlived its like useful life, it was this giant tower case. I
The
became a
kids
file
today just
saver
have
under my
no
desk.
idea.
I used it until the very last minute. And that was the last fully assembled, like fully leaded
Like all in one.
non-notebook, like built out tower PC I bought until 1 month ago when I bought a gaming computer. The first PC I bought in years. I work for Intel, man. Like I bought, and I just like notebook computers for 25 years, and I finally bought a gaming computer like a month ago, mostly for my kid, but also kind of for me, and it's been fun. So that's what I'm going to play Cyberpunk 2077 on. Now that I've got something that's kind of up to it and has a good video card, but like this computer, which is a thumping computer, cost half of what that Micron did.
Yep.
And like that's $5,000 in 1995. So what's that worth now? 7,500. I could buy 3 of this gaming computer
Yep.
for like, it's amazing how much cheaper good computers got.
Oh, and it does like
yeah.
almost 100 times better processing than what you had back in the day too. Yeah.
I mean, like once again, the video card in that computer is got 100 times the power of that whole other computer. Like,
Yep.
maybe more.
Yeah. I
It
mean,
is insane.
Dude,
you try to
appreciate this.
explain this to the younger generation, and they just look at you like you're talking crazy to them. Like you
Well, I have a
did what?
15-year-old, so I experience this every day. I'm like, and he knows because I'm like, when I was your age, and then he rolls his eyes. He's like, shut up. He's a great kid. Like, but like I love to.
I mean, when it comes to electronics, we literally did walk uphill both ways in the snow compared to what they've got now.
I mean, it's so true. I remember my first mobile phone, which I had in Singapore in 1997, which was like an Ericsson brick that did 3 lines.
Oh Jesus, these things were huge.
Like, it's crazy. And I was cool. It was like, check this shit out. So I think, I mean, like somebody who's worked in and around technology since like '94, like, but I mean, like, so this is the fun part, right? Because Cyberpunk was all about, I'm going to square the circle here or close the loop or whatever metaphor of choice. Like like Cyberpunk is all about technology.
Someone just posted how much it actually would have cost today. It would have been $10,041
and 12 cents.
You have to bear in mind that I said thank you. I whoever posted that from the bottom of my heart. And you have to remember that when I bought it, I had literally no money, right? So like this was debt. And I don't know, it seemed like a good idea at the time. But I mean, I have worked in the technology industry since then, one way or another, through the game project that crashed and burned, and then through the second startup, which was a web design startup, and then doing technology comms in Asia and then back in the US. And Cyberpunk's about technology anxieties, and you can see those in real life. You can see them when we have anxieties about social media and what they do to our politics, or what they do to our kids, or the rise of AI, or like are our smartphones melting our heads, and like and I understand it, and it's right to be concerned. But also, like the reason why I've stayed in this business is that like it's fantastic. Like I love it. I love the technology, and I love what it enables us to do. And it does come with all of this baggage as well. But I also find it like genuinely miraculous, and when you sort of wallow in cyberpunk, you can lose sight of that. But like this stuff is amazing, and it was great fun living it, even though like neurosis about technology was a huge part of what informed our work on cyberpunk way back in the day.
Yeah, that's a pretty good description of the not only your own thought process, but the feeling you get from reading it and experiencing cyberpunk is neurosis. That's about as good as it
Yeah.
gets.
And we're about
But
to
I
close.
also like I remember I was living in China. I'll tell you one more story because I know we're out of time. And I remember seeing an iPhone for the first time. My buddy Steve Schwankert brought one back from the U.S. and he showed it to me. And like the first moment I saw it, I was like, this is the future. Like I got to have one of those. So I went back and I bought one on my next trip to the U.S. The very first generation iPhone. I brought it back to China. I jailbroke it so I could use it on a Chinese network because they weren't sold in China then. Which was terrifying because I'd spent a mint on this phone, and I was like, oh, I'm going to brick it, like it worked. And I used it until the company I was working for at the time sent me a nasty gram because they used Blackberries, and they're like, you're not allowed to use an iPhone. We don't understand what this is. And I was like, this is the future, man. But I still enjoy technology, and I always have. And I think you can have fever dreams about it, but you should also, I mean, I think the wonder of technology also powered our thinking on cyberpunk at the
Yep.
same time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that much is kind of the basis of the whole thing. Like wondering where technology is going to take us, what's going to be beneficial, what's going to be harmful, and trying to find some middle ground in there that we can use to move forward.
So, we got about 4 minutes left. Will, by all means, hang out with us if you still have some time. We can chat after the show and just catch up. But before we leave, you just bought this gaming PC. Hopefully, you're going to play 2077. I would suggest,
I think
especially,
I kind of feel like I'm obligated to.
yeah,
I felt like I was
you are
obligated to watch
obligated to.
Edgerunners. I feel like I
At
have
this
like
point, you're not
this
only obligated to play
responsibility.
it, but you're obligated to come back and share with us your experience.
It's a
Exactly.
deal.
Especially the
We'll
author
do
of
it.
Arasaka. You're obligated. My suggestion to you is to play on easy mode in the beginning, play through it, enjoy it.
I don't think I have to. I got no gaming chops whatsoever. So yeah,
Exactly. So
training wheels, man.
take it easy. Play it. It's definitely well worth the play
Do as
and enjoying
much
it.
of the side shit as you possibly can. That's where all the really fantastically fun stuff is. It's on
And
everything that happens on the side. It's the little bits of text you find. Like it's going to speak to you in ways.
yep, you're gonna have
I'm looking
Cereburo.
forward
You're
to it.
gonna have Yorinobu, Hanaka. Several, even Militech is in this, so you definitely want to enjoy it and some come, and there's definitely a lot of lore behind it, so you can take a look at it and either laugh or be proud of what you've completed.
Yeah, we'll see whether all that stuff I said about not getting hung up on the canon, like I'm gonna like play it. I'm gonna be like, how dare they? But I'll try not to.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I cannot wait to hear your reactions at all.
exactly. So we'll schedule another time to catch up with you. We do have some more questions. I don't think we went through the complete list of all the
Good.
questions we
I feel
have for
like
you.
my knowledge, especially of like the details of the game back in the day, were exposed a little bit just because I've been away from it for so long. But it was definitely I had a good time, and it's fun to revisit all this stuff.
Yeah.
And
So from it,
I appreciate you making the time.
and dude, we appreciate you taking the time. I mean, I I, I know you're like one of the original dudes. And I didn't even think we were going to be able to talk with you because, I didn't know if you've moved on
I mean,
completely. So we
I
definitely appreciate it.
I know I know that Cyberpunk 2020 is a niche within a niche within a niche of the larger world. But I gotta tell you, man, every time we have one of you guys on the show, I feel like a teenage girl meeting Elvis in the 50s. Like it just overwhelmed with appreciation and
Old wisdom,
admiration.
did you just faint?
I'm just gonna like hold the
I
line with
mean,
that analogy for the moment. But
I got the
but
vapors.
I'm yeah, don't have a swoon on me. But I'm flattered. I mean, like I mean, I don't know. Like, it was great fun. I look back on it with a lot of nostalgia, and as you can tell, I love talking about pop culture. So I'm pretty much always up for that.
And
Yeah,
we
yeah.
we are also all about, discussing scenarios, and from our previous shows, we talk about the previous supplements as well as other game mechanics within Cyberpunk, and we often go on a diatribe of what ifs and various things. I mean, granted, we've been talking with a lot of the old school writers and artists, so we do appreciate all your time that you've taken out for us. So again, I think you were one of those people at least in my opinion, was one of those holy grails that, because you stopped in '95, I wasn't sure how well we would be able to get you back, and I do appreciate all the time you've given
Well,
us
don't
as
tell my
well
wife
as.
I'm the Holy Grail, but it's, it's been a ton of fun. I had a really good time talking with you, and I think back really fondly on this stuff and all the guys and Mike and just it was a long time ago, but it was a trip,
Cool.
and like it changed my life.
Yeah. So if you want to hang out and talk to us, continue to talk to us, that's fine. We just need to close this show because we're a little over 2 hours. So just hang out in Discord. We'll do our little spiel of the
Give
closing.
the outro.
Yeah, the outro. So I'm Cybersmily. I have cybersmily.net, a website that has Cyberpunk 2020 utilities as well as Cyberpunk Red utilities. I'm also have a Discord server, Cybersmily Data Fortress. You can get a link on my site to my data fortress. I also go to a lot of other Discord channels. Try to hang out on those as well as Reddit. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. No offense, but I find them garbage dumpster fires, which I really don't want to deal with. But it is what it is. Anyways, on to you, Wisdom.
I am Derek Bernier, aka Wisdom Triple Zero. I run Datafortress 2020, the largest, most comprehensive site for Cyberpunk 2020 material on the planet. I am on Facebook. I am on Reddit, and I kind of hop around on Discord a bit. Like Will, I am not on Instagram. I am not on Twitter. I don't mess with that stuff. But you can always reach out to us through any means that you can find us. With comments, criticisms, complaints, suggestions. We love to hear from you.
Most definitely.
We'd like to thank you all. Yeah, we'd like to thank you all for listening. We'd like to thank our buddy William Moss for coming on our show,
Here, here.
and we'd like to thank Cyber Nation Uncensored for hosting us tonight, and thank all of you again for listening in with us.
Talk to you next time. Bye.
Cybernation Uncensored.